The stars had always been quiet. For most of human history, people looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. They sent radio signals into the dark. They built giant listening dishes and pointed them at distant stars. They waited. For a long time, nothing answered. Then in the year 2079, everything changed. A small probe sent to the edge of the solar system picked up a weak signal. It was not from a natural source. It was not a pulsar or a dying star. It was structured, repeating, and clearly made by something intelligent. Within 72 hours, every major government on Earth knew about it. Within a week, the world knew. Humanity was not alone. The next decade was chaotic. Governments argued, scientists translated, diplomats practiced speaking into the void. And slowly, carefully, the first conversations began between Earth and the wider galaxy. What humanity found out there was not what the old science fiction movies had promised. There were no friendly aliens with glowing fingers offering peace and wisdom. The galaxy was old, complicated, and deeply political. There were hundreds of civilizations out among the stars, and most of them had been watching Earth for a long time without saying a word. The group that finally made contact was called the Galactic Conclave. It was a council of over 200 alien species, spread across thousands of star systems. Some of them had been traveling between stars for millions of years. Some had technology that made human science look like cave paintings. They were polite, organized, and very clear about one thing. Humanity was new, humanity was small, and humanity should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Earth accepted the terms. Humanity joined the conclave as a junior member, which meant they had the right to speak, but not the right to vote on anything important. They were given access to basic star maps, basic trade routes, and very basic medical technology. The conclave kept its most advanced knowledge locked away, reserved for older and more trusted species. Still, humanity moved fast. By 2120, humans had built their first real starships. By 2140, they had small colonies on 3 planets outside the solar system. By 2187, there were over 40 million humans living among the stars, spread across Mars, the asteroid belt, several moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and 3 colony worlds in nearby star systems. The conclave still called them the young ones. Most alien species found humans to be strange. They were too emotional. They made decisions based on feelings and not just logic. They laughed at things that weren't funny. They cried at things that didn't matter. They got attached to objects and animals and places. They named their ships after dead people and old myths. Actually, they seemed to carry the weight of their entire history on their shoulders at all times. But they were also productive, harder working than many older species expected, and they were very, very good at learning. Admiral Serena Voss was one of the best examples of what humanity could produce when it tried. She was 53 years old, with short gray hair and eyes that always looked like they were calculating something. She had spent 30 years in the United Earth Defense Command, in which everyone simply called the UEDC. She had fought in 2 small border conflicts near the outer colonies. She had negotiated with alien merchants, alien pirates, and alien government officials who thought humans were barely worth their time. She had never once backed down from anything. On a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2187, our Admiral Voss was sitting in her office aboard the UEDC command station orbiting Earth when her communications officer knocked on the door and came in with a look on his face that she had never seen before. His name was Lieutenant Yusuf Marin, and he was 26 years old and normally very calm. Right now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. She told him to sit down and talk. He placed a data tablet on her desk. On it was a readout from the Oort Cloud Listening Network, a system of deep space sensors that humanity had built quietly over the past 30 years along the very outer edge of the solar system. The network was not advertised to the conclave. Most of its existence was classified. The readout showed an energy signature, a massive one, moving at nearly 40% of the speed of light, coming from the direction of the outer veil, which was a region of space past the known conclave territories where very few civilizations lived. Vossi studied the data for a long time without speaking. Then she asked him what the formation looked like. He told her. The signature wasn't one ship. It wasn't a fleet of 10 or 20. The formation analysis showed a spread consistent with thousands of individual vessels moving in a coordinated military advance pattern. The computer had been running calculations for 3 hours before Marn brought it to her because it kept rejecting the results as too large to be realistic. Whereas the estimate was 14,000 ships. Voss leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her secure communicator and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first was to the UEDC Joint Chiefs. The second was to the Earth Council, which was the unified governing body of all human worlds. The third was to the Conclave Liaison Office. Within 6 hours, the data had been confirmed by 3 separate sensor networks. The signature was real. The fleet was real, and based on its heading, speed, and trajectory, it was aimed directly at the solar system. Humanity had a visitor coming. The problem was that this visitor had not sent any greetings. The Conclave Liaison, a tall, thin being from a species called the Vereth, arrived at the UEDC command station the following morning. Its name was Ambassador Sear, and it had always been one of the more respectful alien diplomats in dealing with humans. It walked into the briefing room. Hossa looked at the data spread across the wall screens and was quiet for a very long time. Then it said something that made the room go cold. It said it recognized the formation. The fleet belonged to a civilization called the Krethnar. They were an old empire, nearly 1,000 years of deep space travel behind them. They were not members of the Conclave. They had been offered membership several times and had refused every time, because the Krethnar did not believe in councils or agreements. They believed in one thing only: dominance. In the past 600 years, the Krethnar had attacked and destroyed 23 civilizations, not defeated them, not conquered and enslaved them, destroyed them. Every city, every ship, every colony, every living member of those species, gone. The Krethnar called it cataloging. They would study a species first, learn everything about them, and then eliminate them completely, keeping only their data in a massive archive aboard their flagship. 23 species extinct, cataloged. The Conclave had never stopped them because the Krethnar were powerful enough that any direct war would cost thousands of ships and hundreds of billions of lives. So the Conclave watched and shuddered and quietly moved their own populations away from the paths the Krethnar traveled. And now the Krethnar were coming to Earth. Ambassador Sear delivered the Conclave's official recommendation with a tone that was clearly uncomfortable. The Conclave advised humanity to begin the immediate evacuation of the solar system. They would open temporary refugee corridors to 3 Conclave worlds where humans could settle while alternative arrangements were discussed. The Conclave would formally protest the Krethnar advance through diplomatic channels. The Admiral asked if those diplomatic channels had ever worked before. Ambassador Sear was quiet for a moment. Then it said no. Voss thanked the ambassador for the information and escorted it out of the briefing room. Then she closed the door, turned to her officers, and told them to start preparing, not for evacuation, for everything else. Over the next 12 hours, the Earth Council met an emergency session. Every head of government from every human world was connected through secure channels. The meeting lasted 9 hours. There were arguments. There were moments of fear. A few voices called for the evacuation plan, was saying that survival was more important than pride. But the majority did not agree, because the truth was this: if humanity ran, they would have nothing to come back to. The Krethnar did not leave things behind. They cataloged, they erased. There would be no Earth to return to, no solar system to rebuild in. The colonies and other star systems were small and fragile and could not support all of humanity permanently. Running was not survival. Running was a slower kind of extinction. And so the vote was taken. Humanity would not run. The decision was made quietly. No speeches were broadcast to the public. No dramatic declarations were sent to the Conclave. The governments of every human world simply began to move, coordinating through secure UEDC channels in ways that the wider galaxy never saw. The Conclave watched and waited for the evacuation ships to begin launching. None did. 3 days after the initial detection, a second piece of information arrived that made everything more real. One of the long-range sensor buoys in the Oort Cloud network had managed to intercept a tight beam transmission from the Krethnar fleet. It was a short message, clearly a standard advance notice that the Krethnar sent before they arrived at any target. It had been decoded by the UEDC translation team in under 4 hours. partly because human linguists had spent years studying the few fragments of Krethnar communication that had ever been recorded. The message was simple. It said, "Earth will be cataloged, then silenced." When Voss read the decoded message, she printed it on a piece of paper, which was an odd thing to do in 2187, but she had always liked paper. She folded it in half and put it in the front pocket of her uniform jacket, where she would keep it for the next 11 months. Not out of fear, she hid her out of focus, because when the hardest moments came, and she knew they were coming, she wanted to be able to reach into her pocket and remember exactly what was at stake. The Krethnar fleet was still months away. At its current speed, the best estimates placed its arrival at the outer edge of the solar system at approximately 11 months and 2 weeks from now. That was not a lot of time, but it was something. Humanity had always been very good at using the time it had. Voss called a second senior staff meeting the morning after the decoded message arrived. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces of her officers, people she had served with for years, people who were clearly frightened but were doing a very professional job of not showing it. And she told them something that only a handful of people in the entire galaxy knew. She told them that humanity had not spent the last 40 years doing nothing. She told them that there was a program. She told them its name, Project Longwall. The officers in the room who already knew the name kept their faces very still. The ones who were hearing it for the first time looked confused for a moment, then uncertain. Then something shifted in their eyes as she began to explain. The confusion faded. The uncertainty faded. What replaced it was hard to describe exactly. It was not quite confidence. It was not quite relief. It was something more like recognition. The feeling of understanding, for the first time, that the ground beneath your feet was not as thin as you thought. Outside, across the solar system, the planets continued to turn. On Earth, cities went about their business. People went to work, raised families, watched entertainment feeds, argued about politics. Most of them did not know what was coming. The governments had decided to manage the information carefully, to avoid panic, to keep daily life as stable as possible, while the preparations moved forward. And among the stars, moving at impossible speed through the dark, the Krethnar fleet crossed another 1 billion kilometers of space, 14,000 ships, coming for a planet they had already decided to silence. They had done this 23 times before. They had never once been surprised. They had never once failed. But this time, something was different. This time, the target had known they were coming and had been getting ready for a very long time. Yet in the Conclave's Grand Diplomatic Hall, 3 star systems away, Ambassador Sear filed its report on the situation and included one detail that it could not fully explain. When it had been in the UEDC briefing room and had told the human admiral that the evacuation was recommended, the admiral had not looked frightened. She had looked like someone who had just been handed a reason to use something she had been building for years. Sear had served as a diplomat for over a century. It had watched species face extinction-level threats. It knew what fear looked like on 100 different kinds of faces. What it had seen on Admiral Voss's face was not fear. It wrote that detail in its report, underlined it, and then sent an additional private message to its own government that was not part of the official report. The message said only 5 words. "I think we misjudged them." The name Project Longwall had existed in classified UEDC files for 41 years. It had been started in the year 2146, just a few years after humanity made its first contact with the Galactic Conclave. At the time, most people on Earth were celebrating. The discovery of alien life, of a whole galaxy full of civilizations, felt like the beginning of something wonderful. Politicians gave speeches about a new era of cooperation. Scientists talked about all the knowledge that would be shared. People looked up at the stars with something new in their hearts. But not everyone felt that way. A small group of UEDC officers and defense analysts had looked at the conclave data differently. They had read the history files that came with first contact, the quiet records of wars, extinctions, collapsed civilizations, entire species gone from the galaxy. They had seen that the conclave was not a family. It was a collection of powerful groups who cooperated when it suited them and looked away when it didn't. And they had seen the Krethnar. In the file on the Krethnar was not long, but it was enough. 23 civilizations, 600 years of recorded destruction, a pattern that never changed. The Krethnar moved, they cataloged, they silenced. These analysts and officers wrote a report. It was classified at the highest level. It went to a small group of Earth Council members who read it, went pale, and then made a decision that they would keep secret from the general public. From the conclave, and from almost everyone in the UEDC itself. They decided that humanity would prepare, not visibly, not in a way that would alarm the conclave or invite attention from the Krethnar or any other dangerous power. Quietly, carefully, over decades, they would build something. A defense that no one could see coming, a wall standing in the dark, invisible until the moment it was needed. They called it Long Wall because the best walls were the ones that never let anything through. For 41 years, the program ran in secret. It was funded through a dozen layers of budget disguise, hidden inside research grants and infrastructure projects and exploration programs. The people who worked on it were carefully selected and deeply trusted. They lived normal professional lives in the UEDC, while also in secure facilities that didn't officially exist, contributing to the most ambitious military construction project in human history. Hurried by the time Admiral Voss stood in that briefing room and said the name to her officers, Project Longwall had produced three things. The first was the Ragnarok platforms. There were 300 of them, scattered throughout the Kuiper Belt, which was the wide band of frozen rock and ice beyond Neptune at the edge of the solar system. Each platform was roughly the size of a small city, built around a frame of dense asteroid material that made them nearly impossible to detect against the natural background of the belt. They had been constructed piece by piece over 15 years and then assembled in place, camouflaged against the rock and ice around them. Each platform carried two weapon systems. The first was a relativistic mass driver, a magnetic acceleration cannon so powerful that it could take a dense metal projectile and push it to 70% of the speed of light. At that speed, a projectile the size of a small car carried the energy of a nuclear weapon. The physics were simple and brutal. Mass times velocity. At 70% of the speed of light, even a small object hit with the force of a small star. There was no shield technology in the known galaxy rated for a direct hit from a relativistic round. The Conclave had treaties against building such weapons because they were considered too dangerous and too indiscriminate. While humanity had built 300 of them, the second weapon on each platform was an antimatter beam array. This was more precise and shorter range, designed to cut through hull armor at close distances. Less dramatic than the mass drivers, but faster to aim, faster to fire, and able to cycle through targets very quickly. Together, a single Ragnarok platform could threaten a small fleet on its own. 300 of them, firing simultaneously from the Kuiper Belt into an advancing enemy formation, would create a wall of destruction that nothing could push through without catastrophic losses. The second achievement of Project Longwall was the Ghost Fleet. Human ships that the Conclave and the wider galaxy knew about were modest, well-built, reasonably fast, equipped with decent weapons and shields. Nobody was afraid of human warships. They were considered adequate for patrol work, colonial defense, countering in small-scale conflicts. The Ghost Fleet was something different. It consisted of 4,000 warships, and not a single one of them had ever appeared on a UEDC public registry. They did not exist in any file that the Conclave had access to. They had been built in secret dry docks hidden inside large asteroids in the outer belt, using a construction technique that produced almost no detectable emissions. But the most important thing about the Ghost Fleet was not its size or its weapons. It was how the ships became invisible. Human physicists, working in complete secrecy for 20 years, had developed what they called dark drive technology. The principle was complex, but the result was simple. A ship running on dark drive became effectively invisible to every known sensor technology, Conclave, Krethnar, or otherwise. It did not just reduce its signature, it genuinely vanished from detection. The ships became dark holes in space that no scanner could find. When this had required solving three separate problems in quantum field physics that the Conclave's best scientists had declared unsolvable. Human researchers had solved all three. In testing, Conclave sensor ships had passed within 1,000 kilometers of Ghost Fleet vessels running dark drives and detected nothing. Not even residual heat, not even gravity variations. 4,000 invisible warships, armed and trained, waiting in the dark. China, the third achievement of Project Longwall, was the most quietly terrifying of the three. It was called the Shepard Protocol. Shepard was an artificial intelligence, but not the kind of AI that most people imagined when they heard the term. It was not a computer answering questions or running simulations. It was a deep strategic system that had been running continuously for 30 years. Ship processing every piece of military and intelligence data that humanity could gather about the alien species in the galaxy. Most of that data had been gathered covertly. Human intelligence operatives working through Conclave diplomatic channels had spent decades quietly collecting information. Battle records, fleet doctrine files, tactical analysis reports, historical accounts of alien military engagements, communication intercepts from dozens of species. Some of the most valuable data had come from the Conclave's own archives, which humanity was not officially authorized to access at the level of detail they needed. The methods used to obtain it were things that nobody wrote down. For 30 years, Shepard had consumed all of this data and done one thing with it. It had learned. It had learned how alien militaries thought, how they planned, how they reacted under pressure, what decisions their commanders made at different stages of a battle, what formations they preferred, what their standard responses to ambush were, what they did when they were losing, and what they did when they thought they were winning. And Shepard had studied the Krethnar more than any other species. 600 years of Krethnar military history lived inside Shepard's databanks. Every battle it had records on, every fleet engagement, every planetary assault, every tactical decision made by every Krethnar commander in the historical record. Shepard could predict, with a high degree of accuracy, what the Krethnar fleet would do in almost any scenario. Not perfectly. War was never perfect, but well enough to plan against. Well enough to set traps that their doctrine would lead them into. Well enough to be one step ahead. Admiral Voss had spent 3 months working with Shepard before the Krethnar were ever detected, running through various invasion scenarios as part of standard contingency planning. She knew the system well. She trusted it the way a chess player trusts a grandmaster coach. Not to fight the battle for her, but to tell her what the other side was likely to do next. Now she was going to need everything Shepard knew. The 11 months between the initial detection and the estimated arrival of the Krethnar fleet became the most intense period of preparation in human history. The Ghost Fleet was moved, its 4,000 ships repositioned in complete silence across the outer solar system, using dark drives to remain invisible while taking up carefully calculated positions inside and along the edges of what Shepard had designated as the most likely approach vector of the Krethnar advance. Some ships moved deep into space along the fleet's expected path, days of travel ahead of where they would be needed, waiting in perfect stillness and perfect darkness. 200 Ghost Fleet captains were given the same basic instruction. Find your coordinates. Move there. We'll shut down everything that isn't life support. Wait. Do not transmit. Do not move. Do not give any sign that you exist. They followed the instruction without question. The Ragnarok platforms were checked, serviced, and armed. Each one ran a full diagnostic cycle. Ammunition stores, if you could call relativistic metal rounds ammunition, were verified and ready. Targeting systems were updated with Shepard's latest models. E-power systems were pushed to peak capacity and held there in standby mode. 300 platforms, cold and dark in the Kuiper Belt, holding their breath. Meanwhile, the visible UEDC fleet, the ships the Conclave knew about, the ships on the public registry, was positioned in ways that made sense for a civilization attempting a defensive last stand. Patrol ships near the outer planets, a small group of destroyers near Jupiter, some orbital defense platforms around Earth. Nothing special. Nothing that would make a Krethnar advanced scout worried. That was intentional. Because 9 months into the 11-month countdown, one of the Oort cloud sensor buoys detected something small and fast crossing the outer edge of the solar system. It was moving very quickly and trying very hard to be quiet. It was a Krethnar scout probe, a small automated device sent ahead of the main fleet to gather targeting data. Shepard had predicted it would come. He had predicted the exact window within which it would likely arrive, had recommended that it be allowed to enter the solar system, gather data, and transmit back. What it would see was the visible UEDC fleet, the normal patrol ships, the outer planet defenses, nothing hidden, nothing threatening. What it would not see, because there was nothing to see, was the Ghost Fleet or the Ragnarok platforms. The probe traveled into the solar system, spent 4 seconds gathering data, and began transmitting back to the Krethnar fleet. It had been transmitting for 4.3 seconds when a single, precisely aimed railgun round from a hidden Ghost Fleet ship shredded it into dust. The transmission was incomplete. The Krethnar fleet received a partial signal from its scout probe before it went dead. In the Krethnar fleet's command structure, a junior intelligence officer filed a report noting that the scout probe had been destroyed, likely by a human defensive weapon, and that the signal had been cut short before full data transfer. The officer recommended sending a second probe. The Krethnar Grand Admiral, a being named Thovek, reviewed the report and made a different decision. Probe destruction was normal. Enemy defenses usually tried to eliminate scouts. The partial signal had shown what was expected: a modest, inadequate human defense. Nothing worth changing the battle plan over. The plan would proceed as designed. Narada Thovek had run this exact operation 23 times. He had never changed his battle plan based on a destroyed probe. He was not going to start now. This decision would define everything that came after. Back at UEDC Command, the destruction of the Krethnar probe was reported to Admiral Voss. She listened to the account, confirmed that the transmission had been cut at 4.3 seconds, and then asked Shepard to model what the Krethnar High Command was most likely to conclude from the incomplete signal. Shepard's answer was quick and confident. They would conclude their defenses were adequate. They would not change the approach formation. They would advance as planned. Voss looked at the holographic display of the solar system above her command table. 14,000 ships coming from deep space. 10 weeks away now, every piece of her preparation in place. The Ragnarok platform sitting cold and silent in the Kuiper Belt. The Ghost Fleet invisible and waiting along the approach path. Shepard running through its final battle models, updating probability estimates, refining the coordinates of the trap she had spent months designing. She thought about the 23 species the Krethnar had destroyed. She thought about the message in her front pocket. Earth will be cataloged, or then silenced. She thought about 8 billion people on Earth who were going about their lives right now, not knowing what was coming, trusting without knowing it that someone was standing between them and the dark. Then she turned to her senior staff and told them that in 10 weeks, when the Krethnar fleet crossed the heliopause and entered the solar system, they were going to walk into the most complete trap ever built by any civilization in the history of the galaxy. And they were never going to see it coming. One of her officers, a young captain named Dara Wells, who was 29 and had joined the UEDC straight out of university and had never seen a real battle, raised her hand and asked one question. She asked what they should do if something went wrong. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she said that they would figure it out, because that was what humans did. In the conclave diplomatic halls 3 star systems away, when Ambassador Sear was watching the situation reports and noting with growing confusion that humanity still had not launched a single evacuation ship. Not one colony transport had moved toward the refugee corridors the conclave had opened. The humans were just sitting there, waiting. For what, Sear could not fully understand. But the feeling it had first felt in that UEDC briefing room had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. Something was hidden here. See, something the humans had never shown anyone. And in 8 weeks, whatever it was, the whole galaxy was going to see it for the first time. The Krethnar fleet dropped out of transit drive at 0300 hours, Earth Standard Time. One moment, the outer edge of the solar system was quiet and dark. The next moment, 14,000 ships appeared from nowhere, snapping into real space with a burst of energy that lit up every sensor buoy in the Oort cloud network. And the signal reached UEDC command station within seconds. Admiral Voss was already awake. She had been awake for 20 hours straight, working through the final preparation checks, reviewing Shepard's last round of battle models, walking the corridors of the station and speaking to her people. She had slept for 3 hours in the early part of the previous day and decided that 3 hours was enough for now. When Lieutenant Marin appeared in the doorway of the command center and said the words she had been waiting 11 months to hear, she simply nodded, set down her coffee, and walked to her station. "They're here," she said to the room. The command center went very still for 1 second. Then everyone moved at once. On the holographic table at the center of the room, the solar system map updated in real time. 14,000 contacts appeared along the outer edge, their positions marked in red, and their projected course lines stretching inward like long red fingers, reaching toward the inner planets, toward Earth. Voss studied the formation for a long moment. It was textbook Krethnar. She had seen this exact spread in Shepard's historical files a dozen times. They entered in a wide fan formation, spreading their ships across a broad front so that no single defensive position could engage more than a fraction of the fleet at once. The front wave would draw fire and identify defensive emplacements. The second and third waves would overwhelm those positions,